Welcome to today's presentation, New Research Brings Security to DevOps, Why Security Matters in the SDLC. Let's go ahead and get started. Alan, take it away.
Thank you so much, Erin, and thank you for those attending and watching this recording on demand. It is a great pleasure and honor to really be here with Galen, somewhat of an expert, I would say, in our lead and being our lead in compliance and security architect. And we've reached out to, having been involved in DevOps for, I guess, since our inception, as we are transitioning now into more of a DevSecOps world, we had some underlying questions that were driving some of our messaging and some of our understanding of the market that we really wanted to find out. So the objective, we reached out to IDG and their CSO magazine subscribers, was to really determine how the adoption of these DevSecOps practices in nowadays, how does it impact the software development lifecycle? So as we reached out to CSO Online subscribers from November through December 4th, late last year, so very recent results. And this is going to be a sneak peek of these results that you're seeing. There's going to be a white paper produced and some more in-depth analysis of the results that we will obviously share with all of you in attendance going forward in the coming days. We reached out to companies with 1,000 or more employees. So we wanted to reach to a medium to large size enterprises. We truly wanted to have decision makers, so we restricted the responses to those with titles of IT director or above, and with a special focus on security as their background. So you'll see, we'll show you some of the results there on the demographics of the companies that responded to us. Ultimately, we ended up with about 20 online questions, which obviously excluded some of the pre-screening and the demographic questions. And we had 108 qualified completes and responses to this, quick burst of 2-week responsive surveys. In terms of demographics, we had top 3 industries got responses for this. Among, I think, 12 or 13 different industries that covered, but these were the top 3. Financial services had a representation of 21%. High-tech companies had 18%, and manufacturing, which kind of was a surprise for us, had 15% response in the overall number of responses there. The titles revolved around a little over half of them were directors. 30% were department heads, what we call the CX suite. Could be CIO, a CTO, or a CISO. And then the remaining 18% were around the VP and EVP levels. So when we asked about their security involvement, 91% of them said that security was among their top 3 efforts and time spent resources. And 94% of those were I&O with top 3 time dedicated responses. And essentially, we reached out to what summarizes here is really the security and I&O audience, which was kind of an interesting outcome from what we were trying to identify. A key part of our question, so one of the first questions we asked was, who is the primarily responsible for development of the application and enforcement of security policies and procedures with respect to your software development? Well, overwhelmingly, 76% of them said that security responsibility still lives and is responsibility overall from the IT organization under a CIO or CTO. And only 20% have a dedicated security discrete function under an independent CISO or CSO. In many cases, CIO and CTOs had some level of director of security as well responded to it. Only 2% had either third parties responsible for or directly within each DevOps responsibility teams. Then the next question we asked was, how important is the integration of software in the development and software development lifecycle, SDLC, I guess for short. within the firm. So what we found out that almost 60% of respondents thought it was crucial to have security integrated within the SDLC, and 31% very important. So ultimately, I guess the industry understands the importance of having security really integrated into the software development lifecycle. So I have a poll question for the audience now that I want for you to answer. How do you adopt DevSecOps practice or do you adopt DevSecOps practices in your software development lifecycle? So we want to see from you. I'll give you a few minutes to submit your responses. Please make sure to answer that question so we could get this tally going. All right, a couple more seconds. And let's see, do you adopt DevSecOps practices within your software development lifecycle? There we go. About 31% are unsure, 50% say yes, and 18% say no. Now there's a follow-up question, okay? For those that responded that you did get your security and compliance or security in the SDLC process, when is the most important stage of the SDLC do you consider that you do the most security and compliance assessment and testing? Is it within planning before you start the process? Is it within coding? Is it within building the solution? Is it within testing the solution? Is it once you release the process? Is it within your deployment process? Or is it once you're running or operating it? Or within monitoring your operational systems? I'll give you a few seconds to respond there. Pick the most important stage you think is your development, or when your security is most important in the software development lifecycle. All right, a few more seconds there. Let's see what the crowdsourcing is responding. All right, so we have a tie, a two-way tie, I guess. Within planning, you plan on testing, and you do while you're operating your systems. And monitoring, I guess we could almost group those together. So it's once in production is when you're continuously assessing your security and compliance. And that question was interesting because we asked the audience that we had reached out with this survey, at what point in the software development lifecycle do you really get to assess your security? Unlike you that only could choose one, we had our respondents being able to respond at various points. So they could choose more than one location. So this is the overall findings that we saw. And the ones highlighted in the darker colors show where the majority of those respondents. So it's kind of in line with what you were saying from the audience. You plan to do security testing and assessment. You have deployment with 73% being the most respondents. And we have also within the testing stages of the SDLC. But one thing that intrigued us when we had the survey was our really some assumption was that that security testing was later in the stages. So we were kind of surprised that we had a very separate kind of the very even distribution of where security was being assessed. And then so we took another look at the data, and we kind of divided up the results and the surveys to really determine if from those that adopt DevSecOps practices versus those that do not adopt DevSecOps practices. So we have adopters of DevSecOps and non-adopters of DevSecOps. And this was an interesting finding that we saw, was that it's pretty even distributed for adopters. But more importantly, when you look at the non-adopters, you see that the most concentration of respondents of where they're testing is within deploy. Another interesting aspect is also the highest disparity between, or the highest use of within planning as well would be the second most important area where non-adopters are using their security and compliance assessments. And lastly, here's where the most distinction between adopters and non-adopters was really within the testing environment. One thing you notice is that most non-adopters, the respondents for non-adopters, they only had one peak at deploy, and most of them were under 50% in other stages. But when you look at adopters, you see that they're pretty evenly distributed, and most are 50% and above throughout the development lifecycle. So the assumption here is that we are having the adopters of DevSecOps practices are truly adopting a comprehensive, every stage of the process, they're adopting security and compliance assessments. Galen, do you have any findings here, any thoughts on this slide as well, or what are your thoughts here?
Alan. Yeah, I mean, I think this shows pretty clearly that the groups that operate in kind of DevSecOps or adopting security into the lifecycle, it's a consistent process. It's a component that is intrinsic or inherent to their development process. We see a bit of a dip in the code side, right? Some code analysis components, but really in the planning side, the testing side, and deployment, as we've highlighted, are really key components in terms of adopters really bringing security into the lifecycle. And what we'll see here as we go forward is that it really helps them as they get through their velocity.
Okay, before we go on, I have another poll question that we want to know. In the past year, how many times has your organization released an application to production with known security vulnerabilities? Has it been once? Has it been 2 or 3 times? 4 to 5? More than 5 times? Or you really don't know how often your organization has released an application to production with known security or compliance vulnerabilities? Obviously, you probably guessed by now that this is a question we asked our survey questionnaires, so it's interesting to see how you compare your response to our results. So if you don't mind responding that would be great, so we could do a compare and contrast. Give you guys a couple more seconds. I think this one, Galen, is where we really find some interesting responses. Okay, the majority of you don't know if we've released application with issued known securities and vulnerabilities, and only a few of you said you know that once you've responded. Well, the 108 respondents that we got from the CSO online community show that 3/4 of the companies really released the vulnerabilities at least 2 or 3 times in the year, or at least 2 or 3 times in the year. And on average, these companies released 2.6 applications to market with vulnerabilities and issues. Galen, any thoughts here?
Yeah, this is a really interesting statistic. This is to say that of the groups that release a application in production with known security vulnerabilities, it happens 2 to 3 times on average. This is not just applications that have vulnerabilities after the fact, but applications that were released with a known security vulnerability in the application or in a dependency, which is to say the security was not able to be effective enough in solving problems before the application went out to production, right? The risk decision was that we would rather have an insecure application out there than to actually go through the process of securing the application, which is in today's day and age, as we deal with ransomware, as we deal with state-level hackers, all these types of things, feels very scary to me as a security professional, right? So I don't quite, we're really working to understand how companies have resolve this internally in terms of their risk decision making. I think Alan went on mute real quick, so give him a second to come back here. Maybe having some audio difficulties, so I'll take over from him for a second here. Here's another question we wanted to ask. You may have already asked it, but on average, how long do your typical compliance and security audits take? Less than a month, 1 to 2 months, 3 to 4 months, 5+ months, or kind of continual audit, or you don't know? Go ahead and pause here. Let's see if we can't get Alan back online.
Galen, crowd, can you hear me?
There you are. Welcome back.
All right, cool. Forgive me for that. So I heard you were responding to the typical questions. So how long does a typical compliance and security audit take place in your organization? Let's see what the respondents say. All right. We see that half of you say that it takes between a month and 2. A third say that less than a month. And the remaining don't know. That is an interesting question. We also asked this question to our audience in part of the survey. And most companies like yourselves have responded that security audits take between 1 and 2 months. On average, the security audits take around 2.1 months. So this was kind of an interesting finding there, that we had assumed that they were a little bit faster, right? But we really found out that they took that much time. Like, that was one part that I was kind of surprised with the audit. Another question, a few questions that we also had within the audit arena is allowed us to come to some audit realities and some conclusions that on average, the security scan took about 5 hours for most companies to complete. And then the complete security and compliance audit on average took 2 months, with 73% of the respondents taking 1 month or more, which was kind of surprisingly long in my view, in terms of what I had expected from a personal perspective in terms of the time it took for an audit to take place. Well, security teams are generally efficient in providing feedback, but most companies have high confidence on the feedback that security compliance and security teams are providing in their reviews of their systems, right? But how quickly is that feedback being implemented back into the system was one area that we really wanted to dive in a little deeper. We found out that they're effective in providing that, in implementing that feedback, but they could do better. Where most companies believe that the effectiveness of the integrated security feedback is effective, but there is room for improvement. So only 28% of the respondents believe that they were extremely effective in integrating that feedback. So one, it takes a long time to get that audit, and it takes somewhat of somewhat time to implement those feedbacks back into the system. So those were the key interesting aspects that I saw assessment that we did. Galen, anything else from your perspective that kind of stood out for you on this?
Yeah, the interesting part for us is that we really are finding that the information given from security back into operations and application teams is viewed as pretty accurate. It is generally viewed as a useful piece of information, and it's really just the length of time that it takes to complete these audits that is really the big killer here, right? 2 months is a lot of time to tie up resources to audit the systems and validate them and kind of get through that process. The fact that the feedback is useful was actually a bit of a surprise to me as well. We expected to see a bit more kind of standoffishness around that topic.
All right. As we go on, also, if there are any questions you want to make, there's the Q&A tab on the bottom of your screen, which you can start asking those questions, and we'll address them as they come in or at the end of the presentation here. I promise you this is the last question we have for you and how you compare to our overall respondents. How does involvement from the security team impact the pace, the speed of your software development lifecycle? So we had some assumptions here when we asked this question, and we wanted to either prove or disprove those assumptions, right? Does involvement of security make it faster, or does it slow down? Or there's no impact in the speed of your delivery process? Or do you not know on how quickly security's involvement team impacts your software overall delivery process and timing? I think one of the assumptions we had that it was going to slow them down, right, Galen, in terms of when we asked that question. So when we see the respondents, oh, there you go. So the majority of you also believe that involving security impacts the pace. It slows down your process in delivering your overall delivery process. Well, here's an interesting aspect. And when we asked that question, we saw pretty much the same kind of even division when we had an overall response. But we really wanted to have this adopter versus non-adopter perspective. So what we see is that the orange adopters of DevSecOps practices, remember those that have a continuous compliance approach in every stage of their software development lifecycle, believe that 47% of them believe that they are faster by involving security early and often in the process. Their software delivery process is faster, versus 42% of non-adopters believe that they are slower. So it's really that balance of secure and speed that has this really impactful message to your organizations, and something that we truly believe. I was really surprised by this finding, Galen. How do you see this adopter versus non-adopter in terms of speed of delivery in the software process?
Yeah, this is where I think the data got really interesting for us in the sense, because I agreed with you that my assumption was going to be based on some data we had from Gartner from a couple of years ago, that most individuals, both in InfoSec and in operations, viewed security as slowing down the process. And I expected to see that data bear out again here in this survey. And as you point out, people who have adopted it say the opposite, which is what we believed to be true, but it was interesting to see how many people had started to actually adopt the process. And I think that's really telling here, is that organizations that have adopted DevSecOps practices believe and have data to prove that they are faster on software delivery. They're faster on their business outcomes, their ability to get products to market as a result of security's involvement. The folks who have not integrated it in still have security as that blocker to production, blocker to progress, right? They're viewed as the cops of the world, right, standing there before you can go to production, and they are big, heavy-handed, very slow processes to work with. And as we kind of go through these next couple of slides, we're going to start to see some really interesting components around DevSecOps adoption and the effect it has on organizations' velocity.
And one point to remember is that the adopters have been throughout the process, and for non-adopters, it's really waiting to the end of the process when there's an aggregation and expectation of security checks, which pushes everything back to the initial stages. So it's truly that broad blocker, that last mile blocker before it goes into. We asked also in terms of speed, but we also asked around quality of the software delivered. So overall, we asked, how does the involvement of security teams impact the quality of the software you are delivering? And here we have overwhelming majority agree that by involving security, they are able to improve the overall quality of their applications. And this is a direct quote from one of the customers and one of the respondents. Only 13% say that there's not an impact in the quality of the software by involving the security assessment there. Then
and this
another
is
question,
too, because I just want to add to this that this is true. Everybody believes this, regardless if they've actually adopted DevSecOps or not, right? This isn't just an adopt or non-adopter thing. Everybody understands that security involvement is critical to build a better quality application, right? There's a viewpoint and an understanding of the world that security brings to the table that we have to involve in our development process, regardless of if we've actually adopted, putting security into the planning stage or the coding stage, things like that, as we saw in those earlier stages of the SDLC.
So then we asked, has your organization considered adopting DevSecOps approach or practices to address security concerns? So we wanted to know what, in terms of what the adoption of these practices were within the organizations. And one area that I was kind of pleasantly surprised was that 47% of the respondents said that they were currently adopting some level of DevSecOps practice. Another 31% were planning on adopting, and 18% were considering adoption. So I think overwhelmingly the factor that most organizations have adopted or are considering adopting or planning on adopting some level of DevSecOps practices. It's curious now to find out what's keeping them from adopting those practices, since it's been kind of proven that it is of value, right? So one kind of long response that we found was of what's preventing these organizations was kind of interesting. It's money, times, and resources that they needed to make the business case for such an endeavor to really support the involvement of security early in the process. And hopefully some of these findings and some of these results will help make sure that you are equipped with the information that allows you to validate that it is important for you to have security and compliance assessments throughout your software development lifecycle. Was a key aspect for me, is like, this is really some cool information that we really want to drive home.
Yeah, and to add to that, Alan, I think one of the key things here is this ties back into one of the first questions around where does security live, right? When security lives under the CIO and lives in this kind of IT, I&O, operations cost center component, it's hard to make an accurate decision just around risk, because when we make a risk call, the business is making a judgment call on that. What's key about this data, about this information, is that putting security into the software development lifecycle allows us to deploy better quality applications faster and more securely, making us better software performers, regardless of the risk components that we're solving as well. So this is a key component in terms of helping make that argument that we really do need to integrate this stuff into the pipeline, not just because it's better from a risk standpoint, but it's actually better from a quality and an application delivery standpoint as well.
Great points. And then from an adoption perspective, we asked those that responded that have currently adopted, how long ago have you adopted DevSecOps practices? And one aspect that we found out was interesting here was that 81% of those respondents have adopted DevSecOps practices within the last 2 years. So the adoption of DevSecOps practices is a fairly recent phenomenon, where most of these companies have adopted these practices within 2 years or less, at almost always at about the same time. There were some leads in the early stages. 18% or 20% of companies have within 5 years, 8 there, and 10 within 3 and 4 years. So it's really impressive, the numbers of and how early we are in the DevSecOps practice. So don't despair is my overall recommendation here, is that this is a fairly new phenomenon, and it's important that you're looking for and trying to collect information so that we can help you adopt these DevSecOps practices earlier in your process as well.
Yeah. And I think to add to this, Alan, one of the interesting components about this is this, I think, helps kind of temper that 47% number we're seeing on the currently adopted, right? When we see that and you're looking at yourself, you're looking at your organization and be like, well, we're not part of that group. I suspect that knowing the speed at which it takes enterprises to actually adopt new technologies and new processes, that 1 to 2 years means we've got some groups within our organizations that are doing this right. We have some kind of leading, kind of forward-thinking departments or teams that are doing this really well, but the organization as a whole hasn't made this happen, right? We see that with our customers as well. It's that, like, kind of the web ops, the DevOps teams that have been able to kind of go free and make this stuff happen quickly are really doing a great job. But a bunch of those kind of business critical applications, what we like to call legacy applications, those teams often are still kind of stuck behind the curve, be due to regulatory requirements or other kind of components. So I echo Alan's component of, like, don't despair if you're not there. What I will say, though, is that if your organization is not actively looking at adopting DevSecOps, then you are behind the curve, right? But if you haven't adopted DevSecOps yet, I don't think you're behind the curve just yet. I think you're in the right spot there.
Very good points. And still, remember, if you have questions, please submit them in the Q&A. I see a couple of questions already coming in, so I'm excited about that. And we'll get to that in a few minutes. And lastly, one of the last kind of questions we asked in our survey was, okay, what are the benefits or perceived benefits you have of integrating DevSecOps practices into software development lifecycles? So we really wanted to know how impactful those and where that impact was being delivered. And here's where we found is that 64% of the respondents believe that it improved the efficiency of audits. 61% reduced the risk of breaches in their systems. 54% had greater agility, and within a few points, security points or percentage points, faster product rollout, increased innovation, and ultimately cost savings was surprisingly the last item that they ranked in these options. So if you really put them together, the efficiency in audits, greater agility, and faster product rollout, that could be all associated with speed, and the reduced risk of breach and increased innovation could always kind of be in a more secure and better quality software kind of bucket if you group them accordingly there. So it ultimately what it boils down to is DevSecOps practices throughout the process, throughout your SDLC, makes the organizations most efficient, secure, and agile by consequence. So this is, I think, the bottom line in terms of the results and the validity of adopting DevSecOps practices like we mentioned earlier. And here's some final kind of closing thoughts and some of the findings that we found. There's overall a very positive view of security and their involvement. Like we said, that the majority of security still falls under IT umbrella, with 76% of those, with only separate, only about 20% responding that they fit into a separate independent organization. Every respondent in the organization, pretty much the majority responded that it is crucial to be part of having security part of the SDLC, with 59% of the respondents believing that integrating security in this SDLC is crucial, and the others are important or very important. Almost 3 out of 5, 57%, assess security in 5 or more stages of the software development lifecycle. Back to that number that DevSecOps adopters are seeing using those assessments throughout the SDLC. Audit obviously causes friction, like we said, in terms of the security scans taking a short amount of time, but the audience really taking 2 months to take it. And really what impressed me was that 3/4 of the organizations deploy apps to production with vulnerabilities more than once a year, and those represent 2 or 3 applications per year with vulnerabilities. That's quite of an impressive number in my mind, as we're striving to have no vulnerabilities released to the market, to the wild. That was a key finding for me. And important, I think, to highlight here is also the distinction between adopters and DevSecOps non-adopters, right? Where reduction of risks of breach, 68% of adopters and only 52% of non-adopters have validated that. And faster product rollout, 52% of adopters versus a measly 35%, a third of non-adopters believe that it is faster to production, to allow security to be involved in the process. And cost savings, 47% responded that they believe cost savings, and only 30% of non-adopters believe that there's some cost savings by involving security in the process. And that ultimately that DevSecOps does impact speed. 47% of respondents say they are faster, and 42% of non-adopters say that they are slower. Remember that overall DevSecOps helps with the speed of the delivery in that process. So Galen, we know now that organizations need to adopt DevSecOps practices. How do you see Chef and our portfolio assisting these organizations that want to become part of the, massive organizations of 47% of adopters? How do we help them become more efficient and effective in bringing better quality to market faster?
Yeah, so let's go ahead and talk about the ways in which companies actually adopt DevSecOps, right? So how do we actually do security and compliance automation in this particular world? And the first thing to kind of drive into is let's talk about what it means when we talk about the non-adopters. Really, this is the traditional approach we see, is that, developer works on an application, or we're working on infrastructure changes. We promote the code from dev to QA to staging. There's a big security review process. All of a sudden, we find all these vulnerabilities. We have to go back to the beginning and start all over again. Often, it's very manual. It's slow. Relies on scanning tools that generate a lot of data, so it's hard to manage the data. And they catch problems really late in the development cycle, particularly if your teams are operating in a kind of a more waterfall approach where your releases are 3 months, 6 months, things like that. You have large amounts of changes to deal with, and you're spending a lot of time going through that rework, right? And this is the best case scenario of a traditional approach. Some companies don't actually have the security review process here. They actually do it after the fact in production. They say, we're going to push to production, and then we're going to go ahead and look at it from there. When we're talking about those teams and companies that have pushed out those 2 to 3 vulnerable applications per year, almost certainly that's the kind of process that they're working on and going from there. And then to add to this, there's the audit problem as well, right? So the development problem is one component of it, but the other piece to it is this, when we do an audit and it takes us a couple months to get through it, what we're assuming is happening is this kind of 75, 80% kind of rolling number that looks pretty good, but what's actually happening is because the audit takes so long to complete and there's so much work that happens in between audits, that really what's happening is the systems are dropping in their compliance levels over time. They're drifting out of compliance, and then either right before the audit or during the audit or directly after the audit, we go and we fix them, bring them back up to a compliant state, and again, they drift over time. So we kind of see this curve as we go through it. And because we're only getting the data points on such an irregular interval. And so what's causing this problem, right? We talk about teams believing that security and compliance is slowing them down. And a lot of times it's because of language. When the security team comes and talks to a DevOps team or an application team and says, here are the things you need to do, it's often in a really big report, a PDF report, pulled out of their scanning tools, pulled out of their systems, and handed over as this one big kind of a lump sum. And that's really problematic for these teams who are used to operating in agile fashions. We're trying to operate in these 2-3 week sprints. How do we cut off enough of the things that we can cost it effectively, that we can get progress done without compromising the rest of the workload that we have to do, right? And so what we need to do is we need to first kind of fix the language. One of the first components we really need is this ability to talk to each other in a language that we can all understand. Fundamentally, security hardening is a compliance test of the system. There's a setting that should be true or false on the system that allows us to determine a particular component of the security posture. This example here is looking at the SSH config, and we're saying, hey, the protocol we're using should be protocol 2. Protocol 1 is insecure. It's been known to be insecure for a while. This is the kind of thing we want to have. And the components of this language should have a couple of pieces to it. One, it should have the actual control. In this case, on the right, it's describe SSHD config, do, its protocol, should compare to 2. It should have some metadata or some kind of some context about why this thing happens. That's the description field right there as well. Set the SSH protocol version to 2. Don't use legacy insecure SSH v1 connections anymore, right? Give us some idea from a security and compliance standpoint as to why this thing matters. And also an impact. How important is this actual control? Is this a showstopper? Or is this just a thing like, hey, this would be good to have on a system, right? So we're thinking about the cost of the work or the risk we're about to consume by not doing this work. What does that risk kind of look like? And what we want to do is take these controls and shift them left throughout the software delivery process, right? Either in the testing stages, the deployment stages, getting these rules set up in the planning stages so that developers know which applications they should or shouldn't use, what protocols should be in place, things along those lines, right? These are the kinds of things that allow us to integrate this stuff into the process. And so this language that we're using here, that we're talking about, is Chef Inspect. Chef Inspect is an open source language. It's a testing language designed to solve these problems. We're translating the compliance rules into code. We can clearly express our statements of policy. We're moving our risk from the runtime to the build and test environments, bringing the information earlier into the development cycle so developers get access to the information early. And we're building it in a way that allows us to have the context and the metadata and information that compliance auditors and security teams need to do their jobs as well. And so what this allows us to do is to actually put this through every stage of the process. We can put this into development. We can say, hey, before you even push your code, when you're running on your local VM, when you're working on your test machine, run these security controls. And if we fail them, then let's think about what needs to happen. And we can have the conversation there about, hey, maybe I need an exception for this thing. Maybe my application requires I use execute out of/temp. Or maybe there's some weird thing that requires me to run a web server on port 80 for some third-party application. Whatever those contexts are, we can have the conversation early on before we waste a lot of cycles building things out. So if we start building up this continuous compliance, this continuous view of the world, there's a couple things we can get to combined with a robust DevSecOps security pipeline. And what we can get to is what we're starting to call this kind of human-free zone. We're saying the interaction from a security standpoint of humans in the system, humans to production, is that humans write code of whatever sort, whatever component they need to care about, whether it's application delivery, whether it's infrastructure configuration management, or whether it's security policy. They can commit that code into source code management. We can have all of the role-based access control, all of the kind of components around verification and non-repudiation, and all the components we need to verify who did what, when it was applied, all in that tracked source of truth. Automation servers can then pick up those changes, automatically build the applications and the artifacts necessary, run through testing. And as we start to deploy it, we can bring those security tests into that process. And the human's job is to make a decision when we're ready to push the change to the next environment. Their job is not to log into a system to make that happen. Their job is to go tell the automation to make that happen. And if we do this right, what we can get to is this human-free pipeline, which is to say that a human has no access to production. We can remove SSH, we can remove WinRM and RDP and all the methods in which humans would have an ability to talk in production, and the only way that a change happens is through this secured, hardened pipeline that starts with the source code management on the far left. And what this allows us to do is, from an audit perspective, I can prove exactly what the system looks like in production because I'm testing in production. I can prove how a change got to production because I have the tracking through the entire pipeline. And I can prove that no human has the ability to make a change to production outside of that by proving that there's no access to the system itself. This is the goal of companies who are trying to get to DevSecOps. This is hard at the current stage because there's a lot of effort to get to this. We need to have the pipeline be clean and quick and easy so that operations can do their jobs. We don't want to remove that ability from them. But as we get closer to this, this will really help us solve the audit problem, because the audit problem is not just about the current state of the system. The audit problem is also about how do I prove that the system won't change on me if somebody tries to make a change to it outside of the approved process. And that's really what we want to start getting into. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions. We have the Q&A there, so please feel free to ask any questions you have in there. And Alan, is there anything else you want to close this out with before we get into questions?
No, I think we're good. Let's switch over to the questions, and that's a great point. If you have any questions, please make sure you enter them in the Q&A tab, and we'd love to hear questions from you so that we can maybe address from the survey response or from our chef kind of stance, and where we see this overall being, stand in terms of how we can help your organization. So, Galen, while we wait for these questions to come in, I do have one. Have you seen any of our customers really adopting this or thriving to adopt this human-free zone in their kind of security pipeline?
Yeah, we've actually seen this really cleanly in the federal space in particular, and there's actually also a large insurance company who's done similar things. And what they've done is they said, from an application perspective, if you pass the security rules, so I'll go ahead and go back to this pipeline view. If you pass the security rules in your testing and staging environments, you get the automatic approval from security to push to production, right? We no longer have to have that security review process because we've adopted this continuous compliance, right? We've said, hey, these are the rules that you must follow. If you follow the rules from a security perspective, we don't need to have a separate security review stage. We're already built into the process. And so we have a couple customers who are, in fact, both federal and regulated industries doing this to make changes towards their production systems. We haven't yet seen anybody, there's a few customers in the world who have really removed access to production. No humans get access to production. But there's a couple other ways in which we can ensure the safety and quality of production itself. But yes, in terms of adding in the security reviews into the software development lifecycle, making those a test that the applications and the infrastructure changes have to pass, as soon as those tests are passed, then the code can automatically go out to production at the speed of the business. This isn't to say that, code automatically deploys to production. We're still making the appropriate decisions about when we're going to take the applications offline, if we need to do that for updates. All of those things are still part of the business decision. But the business gets to make a decision, not held up by the security review.
Cool. Very, very, very interesting points. So there's one question that came in, I think, through our survey when we were talking about the survey results. And in my mind, the question is a little kind of hard to understand in a way where it's asking if the company releases software with security flaws, wouldn't it be faster and cost less because they don't have to deal with as much labor resources? They wouldn't have to contend with a lot of hijacks, malware attacks, SQL injections, and other things. I think that's counterintuitive in that question because in my mind, and Galen, correct me if I'm wrong, the more issues you have let out into the marketplace, the more costly it is because obviously you have to do rework. And the assumption that you wouldn't have to deal with hijacks, malware, and attacks, that's erroneous, right? Because you really would, because those vulnerabilities would be out there unattended and making your systems much more susceptible to attacks and issues. Yeah. How do you see that?
So I think there's two pieces to this that are interesting, right? So the first is the development workload assumption, saying, hey, if I actually just ignore the SQL injection attacks or the known vulnerabilities and things like that, that reduces my workload to get an application in production, right? Which is on the face of it true, right? Which is to say, if I don't do the security hardening work, that's less work that has to happen. Therefore, it's less work. The problem occurs in what happens either if and when you're breached, or if and when somebody has designed an attack specific to the vulnerability you have, right? The reaction that a company is required to do, or maybe they aren't required to do, but chooses to do typically, is around this kind of all hands on deck to deal with 0 days, right? When you don't build security into the process, your response to an incident, a security incident, is greatly magnified compared to a team or an organization that has it built in intrinsic to the process. Because what you're running into is that you have basically allowed yourself a massive amount of tech debt to build up from a security perspective. And when you have to go solve it, that's a lot more work than if you were to do it intrinsic to the process, right? And so that's the key difference, is that you're making a risk appetite decision when you're doing that. And fundamentally, in today's day and age, in 2020, with ransomware, with state-level hackers, with all of the ways in which, the bots that are just trying to SQL injection all over the place, you're going to run into the situation where you have to deal with the incident. And in those situations, your workload is significantly higher than if you were to build it into the process from the beginning.
Yeah, those are great points. So if you have any other questions, please make sure you insert them in your Q&A tab. One question I have, and it doesn't necessarily relate to this, but we only have a certain number of known vulnerabilities, or the majority of the issues that organizations have is what, I think 9 or 12 known vulnerabilities that really impact the majority of our systems. So I guess the important aspect is to have the ability to continuously assess and make sure that your systems are in compliance and are secure from those known vulnerabilities. But back to that point where the feedback from security is quickly implemented back into the systems. How do you see Chef being able to help with that speediness of inserting those feedbacks into the system?
Yeah, so as we say, a lot of the breaches that happen today happen due to known vulnerabilities that have been out there in the wild for a while, right? The target attack a while ago was Apache Cupid that had been known about for years, things like that. And we still see a lot of these responses to these big 0 days that happen because they have such a wide potential impact. But fundamentally, what you need to design your systems for is resiliency and speed of making a change, a small change, right? This is why a continuous integration pipeline is critical, so that we have a clean way, a quick way that's consistent about how a change happens to the systems. And what we find is that customers who use Chef Infra and Chef Inspect can fix a 0 day within about 15 minutes of it coming live. The reason for that is we can use Inspect to determine if the system is in question vulnerable to a vulnerability of any sort. And then Chef Infra is a great way to push out a change across the system. And again, having that combined with a pipeline allows you to test it quickly, easily. It's a singular change, and we can go from there. We've had a number of customers who use this to respond to shell shock and other 0 day vulnerabilities throughout their history of using Chef.
Very cool. And I'm going to ask you what are the 3 kind of takeaways you have from the survey, Galen, but I'll offer mine up first, and then you can kind of add to what you found the most interesting and surprising from the survey. In my mind, one area that I thought was quite impressive was that 75%, 2/3 of the companies that we surveyed said that they release at least vulnerabilities at least once a year. That was most jaw-dropping and awe-inspiring. Like, wow, I didn't realize that so many vulnerabilities were released to the market that often. And the other one was I was surprised on how long audits take place, because we always chant on how quickly we can help our organizations and our companies, our customers, really speed up their time with audits. It's almost a non-factor, these audits and compliance audits, right? I was surprised on how long it really takes overall. These organizations, 2 months sounds like a lot of wasted effort in audits and in compliance issues. And the last one was how DevSecOps really helps speed up the process. It was something that we always talked about and how we envisioned that, but having this validation point from a survey was very inspiring, to say the least, that we're on the right track and that we are helping these organizations really become a lot more efficient and effective in securing their environments. What are kind of 3 takeaways from your perspective, Galen, that you found from the survey?
Yeah, mine are pretty similar. The fact that companies knowingly release software with known vulnerabilities boggles my mind. I have not yet had a chance to talk to customers specifically who said they've done that in terms of why they've done that, what risk decisions they made, why it was accessible from the business to do so. But that's a really interesting statistic. It's not just about releasing software that later ends up with a vulnerability and you haven't patched it. There was literally you release the software knowing that it has a vulnerability inside of it is a really interesting component of that. The audit time surprised me a little bit, but not a lot. We see this a lot with customers that audits happen a lot. They're long, they're slow, they're painful. It's 2 months, a lot of manual time, a lot of manual effort to gather the information for them. It's a key component that we do see a lot of people really trying to get away from, or really trying to reduce the workload on particularly on their operations teams, to gather that information and then present it to auditors. And then I will definitely mirror your components on the DevSecOps adoption. I expected to see, the continued state of security gets in our way, they're slow, they don't understand the business, all those kinds of things. But to see that a group of people are saying, no, this makes sense, this is making us faster, it's making us better, and then to be able to see okay, you are the groups that are adopting DevSecOps, right? You have started doing this work, you have seen the benefits of this, is a really great validation of the viewpoint that we've had for years, and to really see that this is in fact the way that security and operations are starting to work together to solve their problems.
Those are great points.
That,
thank you. Yeah, one thing I think that is important to highlight is that we're coming up with ChefConf in the middle of the year, in the summer months, in the beginning of the summer months. And if you're interested in these survey results and in how Chef can help you bring security and compliance streamlined in your adoption of DevSecOps practices, I think it's important for you to consider coming over to ChefConf 2020 in Seattle. So, Aaron, I think you have a few more words on that.
Yeah, thanks, guys. So like Alan was saying, we just recently launched registration for ChefConf 2020. It's taking place in Seattle from June 1st through 4th, and then also in London from June 15th through 17th. So tomorrow is actually the last day to save with our super early bird pricing. You can get your pass for just $5.95, which is the best discount that we're offering for ChefConf. So if you're already looking at attending ChefConf, I definitely recommend getting your pass before the end of the day tomorrow. And with that, I will close out this webinar. As a reminder, a copy of today's presentation is in the resource list widget at the bottom of your screen, so feel free to download that. The on-demand version and slides should be available by tomorrow, and we'll email you as soon as it's ready, and you can access it using the same audience link that you're using right now. So with that, thank you, Alan and Galen, and thanks everybody for attending, and have a wonderful day.